Imagine standing in an open field. It's quiet. The air is crisp, the sky a clear blue. Now, erase that. By the middle of the 19th century, if you stood in the exact same spot in Manchester at midday, you wouldn't see the sun. You wouldn't even be able to hear your own thoughts. The skyline wasn't shaped by ancient cathedrals or grand monuments. It was dominated by hundreds of towering brick mill chimneys. They were vomiting thick, black smoke that hung over the narrow streets like a permanent, suffocating storm cloud. Manchester, in the 1850s, had become something entirely unprecedented in human history. It was a city built, from the ground up, around one single, terrifying obsession: mass production. This wasn't a place that grew organically over centuries like London or Paris. It didn't evolve through careful urban planning. It exploded into existence within a single human lifetime, driven by an unholy trinity of cotton, coal, and steam power. What you're about to see is the city that ruthlessly invented the modern world not through deliberate intention, but through relentless, uncontrolled acceleration. This was the beating, mechanical heart of the Industrial Revolution. To truly understand the shock of this new world, listen to the personal journal entry of Alexis de Tocqueville, a French observer who visited the city and stood amidst the deafening noise. He wrote, with a mixture of awe and horror, "From this foul drain, the greatest stream of human industry flows out to fertilize the whole world. From this filthy sewer, pure gold flows. Here, humanity attains its most complete development and its most brutish. Here, civilization works its miracles, and civilized man is turned back almost into a savage." Those words weren't a poetic exaggeration. They were the suffocating, daily reality. Manchester, before this sudden transformation, was completely unrecognizable, just a quiet, unremarkable market town serving the local countryside. But the machine changed everything. The silence was dead forever. The sky was permanently blackened, and humanity was about to learn the brutal, irreversible cost of progress. To comprehend the sheer violence of Manchester's transformation, we have to look at the numbers. And these numbers don't trace a normal curve of human history. They look like a biological outbreak. In 1750, Manchester was an unremarkable provincial market town. The population hovered around 20,000. People lived alongside the gentle flow of the River Irwell, surrounded by small churches, modest workshops, and green countryside. The rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons, the sun, and the harvest. It was quiet, but then the gears of progress began to grind. Fast forward just one lifetime to 1,850. That quiet population of 20,000 had violently mutated into a sprawling, suffocating mass of over 300,000 people. This was not urban development. This was an industrial stampede. Streets were slapped together in a matter of weeks. Housing was built back to back, with no ventilation, no plumbing, and no long-term planning. These brick boxes existed for one reason only: to pack as many warm bodies near the factory gates as physically possible. The market town had been swallowed whole by the machine. Dr. James Kay, a local physician witnessing this unprecedented overcrowding, documented the horrifying reality. He wrote, "The population is crowded into one dense mass. Families are squeezed into single cellars, damp and unventilated. We have built a city where health is impossible." He was right. The city was physically breaking its own people, but the authorities largely looked the other way. Why? Because Manchester was producing more wealth more rapidly than any city since the dawn of civilization. It had become the terrifying epicenter of global capitalism. But how did this happen so fast? What was the true fuel that turned a sleepy town into a global titan, ripping families from the countryside and throwing them into the jaws of the mills? To find the answer, we have to step inside the belly of the beast. We have to pull back the heavy iron doors of the cotton mill and step into a world where human beings were no longer in control. The moment you stepped through the heavy iron doors of a Manchester cotton mill in 1850, the first thing that hit you wasn't the suffocating heat or the sickening smell of warm whale oil used to lubricate the gears. It was the noise. It was a physical, violent wall of sound that vibrated through the wooden floorboards, traveled up your boots, and rattled your teeth. Imagine hundreds of heavy power looms clattering simultaneously in a single cavernous room. Add to that the high-pitched, frantic whirring of thousands of spinning frames and the relentless, rhythmic slapping of giant leather belts against iron pulleys. All of this chaos was driven by a central, monstrous steam engine that acted as the mechanical heartbeat of the building. The noise level routinely exceeded 100 decibels. It was the 19th century equivalent of standing next to a modern jet engine. Conversation was physically impossible. Workers didn't speak. They survived by reading the room. They communicated through sharp, exaggerated gestures and learned to anticipate the machinery's failures by feeling the vibrations alone. But the deafening roar was only the first assault on the human body. The air inside these colossal brick boxes was a slow-acting poison. To keep the fragile cotton threads from snapping under the immense speed of the machines, the environment had to be kept artificially damp. Windows were securely nailed shut. The temperature regularly hovered around 85 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of whether there was a blizzard outside. And floating within this stagnant, humid oven was the dust. Millions of microscopic cotton fibers filled the air, creating a thick, white fog. It coated the floors like a permanent, unnatural frost. It clung to the workers' clothes, their hair, their sweat, and with every desperate breath, they inhaled it deep into their lungs. Over years of grueling shifts, this invisible fog created a devastating respiratory condition known as bisonosis, or brown lung, effectively suffocating the workers from the inside out. You might assume that this brutal, dangerous environment was manned by hardened adult men, but the truth is far more sinister. The machines didn't require heavy muscle. They required agility. They required total obedience. And most importantly, they required extremely small hands. Which brings us to the darkest, most heartbreaking reality hiding beneath the moving gears. Before the Industrial Revolution, human time was fluid. It was dictated by the sun, the harvest, and the changing of the seasons. You worked when it was light. You rested when it was dark. But in 1850s Manchester, time was no longer a natural phenomenon. Time was a commodity. It was rigid, mechanical, and entirely owned by the factory masters. The new god of this era wasn't the sun. It was the factory bell. Its violent ringing pierced through the dark, damp morning air at 5:30 a.m., echoing across the slums. It didn't matter if you were sick, exhausted, or just a child. If you weren't through the heavy iron gates by 6 a.m. sharp, you were locked out. You lost a quarter of your daily wage, instantly pushing your family closer to starvation. Inside the mill, human labor was completely subordinated to the relentless rhythm of the steam engine, and the machine never tired. The machine never needed to sit down. Therefore, neither could you. Consider the brutal reality documented in the strict rulebooks of the era. A standard mill notice from the 1850s read, "Any spinner found with his window open, fined 1 shilling. Any worker found washing themselves during work hours, fined 1 shilling. Any worker heard whistling, fined 1 shilling. You weren't just renting your labor, you were surrendering your basic human autonomy." Shifts stretched into agonizing 12-to-1, 4-hour marathons, 6 days a week. The concept of a weekend or leisure time simply did not exist for the working class. You woke to the bell, you ate your meager ration of bread only when the bell allowed, and you stumbled back to your dwelling only when it finally released you. In the bitter winter months, workers arrived in the pitch black and left in the pitch black. They could go an entire week without seeing the sun. The human body, evolved over millennia to follow the natural rhythms of the earth, was being violently reprogrammed to function as a disposable biological cog in a giant, steam-powered mechanism. But surely, when the bell finally rang at 8 p.m., releasing thousands of exhausted souls into the night, they found some peace at home? If you think returning home offered a sanctuary, you are gravely mistaken. If you survived your 14-hour shift and stumbled into the Manchester night, your destination was likely a place that defied basic human dignity. The most notorious of these districts were Angel Meadow and Little Ireland. To call these places neighborhoods is a grotesque understatement. They were breeding grounds for cholera, typhus, and unimaginable despair. Following the devastating potato famine of the 1840s, thousands of desperate Irish immigrants flooded into Manchester. By 1851, over 13% of the city's population was Irish-born, and they were forced into the absolute lowest tier of this industrial hellscape. Picture a labyrinth of narrow, unpaved alleys, permanently submerged in a toxic mixture of ankle-deep mud and human waste. Families of 10 or 12 people were crammed into a single, windowless cellar, sleeping on piles of rotting, damp straw. There was no running water. A single communal privy, a literal hole in the ground, might be shared by over 100 people, overflowing into the very streets where children played. Friedrich Engels, a young German observer who walked these exact streets, was so thoroughly horrified by what he saw that it radicalized him forever. He documented this geography of misery, writing, "In a rather deep hole, in a curve of the river, stands Little Ireland. The cottages are old, dirty, and of the smallest sort. A horde of ragged women and children swarm about here, as filthy as the swine that thrive upon the garbage heaps." This horrific squalor wasn't an unfortunate side effect of the city's rapid success. It was the very foundation it was built upon. Exorbitant rent was extracted from the poorest workers to enrich absentee slumlords, keeping the labor force trapped in a perpetual cycle of poverty, sickness, and debt. But in this city, poverty didn't just break the adults. The factory machines had an insatiable mechanical appetite, and adult hands were simply too large, too clumsy, for the most delicate, most dangerous tasks of all. The mills demanded a smaller, cheaper, and far more vulnerable type of worker. The machines of Manchester didn't just consume coal and water, they consumed youth. In the 1850s, the factory floor was no place for a child, yet thousands of children, some as young as 5 or 6 years old, made up a critical percentage of the industrial workforce. They were employed in specific, brutal roles that were deemed physically impossible for adults. The most notorious and terrifying of these roles was the scavenger. Picture the massive spinning mules we discussed earlier. These heavy iron giants moved back and forth across the factory floor at terrifying speeds. As they operated, loose cotton would continuously fall beneath them. It was the scavenger's job to crawl underneath the actively moving machinery, sweeping up the waste cotton, while thousands of pounds of crushing metal swept back and forth just inches above their fragile heads. John Fielden, a factory owner who surprisingly became a vocal reformer, testified to this horror. He stated, "The sight of these little creatures, condemned to this relentless, agonizing labor, is a disgrace to a Christian country. They are subjected to the constant risk of losing their limbs or their lives for a pittance. It wasn't just a risk, it was a daily reality. Exhaustion was a child's greatest enemy. A momentary lapse in concentration, a slip on an oil-slicked floor, or simply falling asleep on their feet from sheer exhaustion meant absolute disaster. Fingers were routinely lost to unyielding gears. Limbs were crushed, and the children who managed to avoid catastrophic physical injury were still being slowly murdered by the environment. Breathing in the thick cotton dust year after year stunted their growth and permanently ravaged their lungs. In the poorest, most industrialized districts of Manchester, the average life expectancy plummeted to a staggering 26 years. You heard that correctly. 26. Generations of children were effectively born to be fed directly into the industrial machine. But the most horrifying truth of all? This suffering wasn't a secret. The government knew. The public knew. So, if everyone knew the cost, how did an entire society justify this slaughter? If the air above Manchester was a toxic fog, the water below was a liquid nightmare. The River Irwell, which wound its way through the heart of the city, did not flow with water. It flowed with industrial ink. Every day, the textile mills and dye works vomited thousands of gallons of toxic bleaching chemicals, heavy metals, and boiling water directly into the river. Added to this was the untreated sewage of over 300,000 residents. The Irwell became a thick, sluggish sludge that literally bubbled with noxious gases. When the Scottish geologist Hugh Miller visited Manchester in the 1840s, he stared into the water and was utterly repulsed. He documented the horror, writing, "The Irwell is considerably less a river than a flood of liquid manure. The water is colored black as ink by the dyestuffs, and it emits a stench that is absolutely overpowering." The stonework of new buildings was coated in a thick, greasy layer of black soot within months of construction. The trees died. The birds vanished. Today, we look at this environmental devastation and see an apocalyptic catastrophe. But the minds of the 1850s saw something entirely different. They looked at the blackened sky and the poisoned river and saw undeniable, glorious progress. Pollution was not considered a negative side effect. It was the literal metric of success. A smoking chimney meant the mill was operating. A darkened sky meant production was at maximum capacity, and money was flowing. The city's profound ugliness was inseparable from its immense economic power. They willingly sacrificed beauty, health, and nature on the altar of mass production. However, Manchester was merely the processing center. It was just the loud, dirty engine of a much larger, far more sinister machine. To truly understand the blood that fueled this empire, we have to trace the supply chain. We have to look far beyond the grimy streets of northern England, across the violent waves of the Atlantic Ocean. Because the pure, white cotton that fed these black mills was stained with a terrible price long before it ever reached British shores. If you followed the toxic, blackened waters of the Irwell out to the sea, you would eventually reach the Atlantic Ocean. And across that vast ocean lay the other half of Manchester's dark economic miracle. The steam-powered factories of northern England were starving for one specific raw material: cotton. They consumed it in quantities the world had never seen before. But cotton doesn't grow in the cold, damp climate of Britain. It had to be imported. By 1860, a staggering 90% of all the cotton processed in Manchester's deafening mills was grown thousands of miles away in the deep American South. This was not a mutually beneficial partnership of free trade. The entire foundation of Britain's Industrial Revolution, the very wealth that built the modern world, was built directly on the backs of enslaved black Americans. Consider the horrifying, mechanical efficiency of this transatlantic supply chain. A slave in Mississippi was forced to pick cotton under the brutal threat of a whip. That cotton was baled, shipped across the ocean to the port of Liverpool, and immediately loaded onto the newly invented steam railway. Within hours, it arrived in Manchester to be spun into thread by a malnourished, exhausted child working under the threat of starvation. The finished cloth was then exported globally to generate unimaginable profit for a handful of factory masters. This global web of exploitation wasn't a secret. The mill owners knew exactly where their cheap raw materials came from. In fact, the industrial wealth of Manchester and the expansion of American slavery were inextricably linked. They fed each other. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway, opened in 1830, had revolutionized transport. What once took days by canal now took mere hours. Faster transport meant faster production cycles, and faster production meant an ever-increasing, insatiable demand for slave labor. Manchester wasn't just a grim, isolated city. It was the beating, mechanical heart of a ruthless global system. But as the immense wealth piled up in the hands of the elite and the bodies piled up in the slums, a volatile tension was building. The extreme, visible inequality of this new capitalist system couldn't be ignored forever. In the dark shadows of these very mills, revolutionary ideas were beginning to take shape. Ideas that would eventually threaten to tear the entire system down. As the black smoke continued to pour into the sky and the textile tycoons counted their unprecedented profits, a deep, volatile anger was festering in the damp cellars of Manchester. The city was physically and psychologically split in two. The wealthy mill owners had long abandoned the polluted center. They built grand, pristine villas in the leafy, upwind suburbs, living lives of quiet, Victorian elegance. They were intentionally, comfortably insulated from the horrific suffering that funded their luxury. Meanwhile, the working class was left trapped in the toxic shadow of the machinery. But this extreme segregation created an ideological powder keg. In the early 1840s, a young, wealthy German man arrived in Manchester to manage his father's textile firm. His name was Friedrich Engels. But instead of remaining safely within the elite gentlemen's clubs, Engels walked directly into the nightmarish slums of Little Ireland and Angel Meadow. He didn't just look, he investigated. He saw not merely poverty, but a systematic, mechanical war being waged by the owners of capital against those who had nothing but their labor to sell. Engels channeled his profound fury into a groundbreaking book, The Condition of the Working Class in England. He stripped away the polite facade of the era, writing with absolute clarity. The English middle classes know no other god but money. They consider the workers not as human beings, but simply as hands. His meticulous observations in the darkest corners of Manchester would directly inspire his closest collaborator, Karl Marx. The horrors witnessed in these very streets forged the core arguments of the Communist Manifesto, ideas that would go on to shape revolutions and fracture the entire globe. The pressure inside Manchester was becoming intolerable. Fearing a violent, French-style uprising on British soil, the government was finally forced to intervene. Parliamentary inquiries were launched, gathering sickening testimony from child laborers and exhausted adults. Slowly, and agonizingly slowly, the first factory acts were passed, attempting to limit working hours and forcing owners to put protective covers over the most lethal gears. But these reforms were little more than a bandage over a gaping, infected wound. The core engine of industrial capitalism remained entirely intact, and it was hungrier than ever, and the most terrifying realization was yet to come. The factory masters had perfected their brutal system, and they were no longer satisfied with conquering just one city. By the end of the 1850s, Manchester was no longer just a city. It was a globally exported system. The terrifying blueprint engineered in these damp, soot-covered streets, the absolute subordination of human life to machinery, the extreme division of wealth, and the relentless consumption of nature was packaged and shipped around the world. Other nations looked at the blackened sky over the Irwell and didn't see a warning. They saw an instruction manual. From the booming steel mills of late 19th century Pittsburgh to the sprawling, hidden factory cities of our modern global supply chain, the ghost of 1850s, Manchester still dictates exactly how our world operates. We sit today in a world of unprecedented comfort, tapping on glass screens, completely insulated from the physical, grueling labor that builds our daily reality. But the machine didn't stop. It just moved out of sight. We began this journey by asking what truly fueled the sudden, violent birth of the modern world. The answer isn't just steam, coal, or cotton. The modern era was bought and paid for with the damaged lungs of child scavengers, the stolen time of a trapped working class, and the poisoned rivers of northern England. Manchester didn't just invent mass production, it invented the modern human condition. The factory bell is actually still ringing. The question is, are we still marching to its rhythm?